Probably no other single industry has played, continues to play, such an important role in our daily lives as the printing industry. In childhood, it gives us the many graphic aids we use in play and learning. And as we grow older, it continues to play an increasingly more important role in everything we do. It takes many kinds of equipment to turn out the great variety of printed materials we require today. Equipment ranging from the relatively simple machines of the small neighborhood job printers to the elaborate, highly complicated equipment of the large plants, specializing in the various kinds of printing work that usually must be produced in large quantities. But no matter how small or large these installations may be, or how simple or complex the equipment, the printing processes that they employ are basically simple ones. And once we understand these basic processes, we can better understand the various methods of printing and use them more intelligently. The oldest process used for large volume printing is the relief process, generally called letterpress today. In this process, the letter or image that is being reproduced stands out from the rest of the surface. Thus, when the letter or image is inked and pressed against the material on which the reproduction is to be made, we get a replica or duplicate letter or image. In this process, it is only the raised or relief letters or images that are inked, and it is these that leave their imprint on the material. The intaglio or gravure process of printing is just the opposite of the relief process. The Italian word intaglio, which means to engrave or cut into, describes how the printing image is made in this process. Apart from this engraved image, the rest of the surface is left untouched. In this process, the entire surface is flooded with ink and then wiped clean, leaving ink only in the depressions which form the image. Now, when the material on which the reproduction is to be made is pressed against the surface with sufficient pressure, it takes the ink from the depressions and a printed image is produced. In between intaglio and relief is the planographic process, better known as lithography, which, as its name suggests, uses the surface itself for printing. This process is based on the fact that grease repels water but holds another grease. And using a sheet of paper and a greasy wax crayon, we can actually see how this works. When we apply water, it's repelled by the crayon image, but it's absorbed by the rest of the paper. Applying a greasy ink next, we find the reverse is true, with the ink sticking to the crayon image, but not to the wet paper. The ink on this image can now be transferred to another sheet of paper. Originally, a stone surface was used for this process, and this was why it was called lithography, or printing from stone. In modern lithography, the printing image is made on a light-sensitive metal plate using a photographic negative. When this image is developed, it has the same characteristics as a crayon image, repelling water and holding the greasy ink. At the press, water is passed over the entire surface of the plate. Here it's done with a damp sponge. Then the surface is inked. And since the ink is greasy, it will stick only to the printing areas of the plate. The non-printing areas, which have accepted the water, will repel the ink. In modern lithography, the printing image is first printed on a rubber blanket. and then transferred or offset to the printing material. For this reason, it's called offset lithography. The stencil or silk screen process, sometimes called serigraphy, uses still another principle for printing. In this process, the printing is done through the surface. The image is cut into the stencil, leaving openings for the ink to pass through. Then, using an adhesive, the stencil is mounted to a screen of fine metal or cloth, usually silk, which explains why the name silk screen is generally used. And finally, the stencil backing is removed. The printing image now consists of openings in the screen through which the ink can pass. The stencil screen is placed over the material on which the reproduction is to be made. And when ink is squeegeed across the entire screen, it passes through the openings in the stencil, and a printed image is produced. These, then, are the 4 basic processes used throughout the printing industry today. Each employs a different principle. In letterpress, it is the image standing out from the surface. In gravure, it is the image cut into the surface. In lithography, it is the image on the surface. And in silk screen, it is the image through the surface. However, although each process is based on a different principle, all of them require the same elements to make a reproduction. In addition to a printing press, they must have a printing image, ink to transfer this image, and a material on which the reproduction or print can be made. Now let's examine each of these elements. The first problem in making a printing image is to produce a replica of the copy or material which we want to reproduce. If this material is type or drawings obviously composed of nothing but lines, we can easily make a printing image. However, if this material consists of photographs, paintings, or drawings characterized by shading or continuous tone, then producing a replica presents a problem, because our 4 printing processes don't lay down ink films of varying thicknesses to reproduce this effect, although some printing methods can come close to it. But there's another way that we can get the effect of shading or continuous tone. It's called halftone technique. It's done by using a pattern of dots instead of lines wherever necessary. These dots are equally spaced, but they vary in size or depth, depending on the effect desired. The smaller the dots, the lighter the tone. The larger the dots, the darker the tone. Printing images can be drawn or cut by hand, just as we're doing with this simple linoleum block. But since modern printing requirements demand faster and cheaper methods of making printing images, photomechanical, photochemical, and mechanical methods are generally used today. For example, movable type, which is the simplest way of setting manuscript copy, is still frequently set by hand for certain kinds of work. But large volume production of magazines, newspapers, and books requires the use of complex mechanical equipment that will set type much faster. When this type is set in the form of lines or slugs, machines such as the linotype or intertype are used. Under the direction of the operator at the keyboard, these machines assemble matrices or molds, which are used to cast the line of type in lead. In the Ludlow system, the matrices are set by hand and are then used to cast a solid line of type. This monotype machine produces a perforated tape, and when this tape is placed on a type casting machine, it serves as a guide for the casting of individual letters and assembling them in lines. Printing images of manuscript copy can also be made photographically. The photographic paper in this magazine, when developed, will produce copy like this. As we saw earlier, printing images of drawings, photographs, or any illustrated material are almost always made by photomechanical and photochemical methods. And these methods usually require special equipment, such as this large camera. The next element we require for printing is ink. Printing inks are made up of three principal ingredients: a pigment, either black or colored, a vehicle to carry the pigment, and a dryer. The properties of printing inks will generally vary according to the process being used, but all will have certain basic properties, such as color, ease of application, and any other characteristics needed for the many different kinds of work. Although paper is still the most widely used printing material, we can print on almost anything. Materials such as cloth, wood, metal, glass, and many kinds of plastics. Often, the nature of the material will determine the printing process that is used. The last element we require is the printing machine, or the press itself. There are several basic types of printing presses, and the simplest of these is the platen press, where the printing image carrier or form is held on a flat surface or bed, with the material on which the reproduction is to be made on another flat surface, usually called the platen. When the platen and the bed are brought together, the ink is transferred from the printing image to the material. The platen principle was the earliest method of printing, and it's still widely used today for small or special printing jobs. The flatbed cylinder press is another basic type of printing machine. It also uses a flat bed for its printing image carrier or plate. However, the material on which the reproduction is to be made is carried around a cylinder called the impression cylinder. When this impression cylinder rolls over the inked printing plate, pressing the material against the printing image, the ink is transferred to the material. The flatbed press prints faster than the platen, and it also permits larger surfaces to be printed. The rotary cylinder press, still another basic type, differs from the platen and flatbed cylinder presses in that both the printing image and the material on which the printing is to be done are carried on cylinders. Thus, in addition to an impression cylinder, this press also uses a plate cylinder. These cylinders turn continuously, pressing the inked printing image against the material as they turn, thus continuously reproducing the printed images. Because of this continuous rotary action, the rotary press can be operated at much greater speed than the platen or flatbed cylinder presses. And it's generally used for work such as newspaper printing, where speed is essential. The offset press is simply a variation of the conventional rotary press, and it's primarily used for offset lithography. It uses an intermediate cylinder covered with a rubber surface or blanket. This cylinder takes the inked impression from the printing image on the plate cylinder and offsets it or transfers it to the material on the impression cylinder. Since each process employs a different kind of printing image, carrier, or plate, different methods of applying ink are required. And each process will also require a different surface against which the printing is done. For letterpress printing, the material on which the reproduction is to be made is held against a hard surface, so that only the printing image comes in contact with the material. Gravure requires a surface which is not quite so hard, so that when the plate is pressed against the material, the ink is drawn out of the depressions of the printing area. Offset lithography differs in that it uses an extremely hard surface, such as steel, with an intermediate rubber-covered surface transferring the image to the material. Apart from the inking and surface differences, the mechanical features of presses will be much the same for all the printing processes. Here are some of the presses used today. Notice that in addition to a printing section, all presses will also have a feeder section and a delivery section. These range from simple hand-fed operations to the highly complicated ones required for the large rotary presses, where the material is fed continuously from a roll. As you can see, there are many ways of using the basic printing processes, and they are constantly being improved. Flexography, which uses flexible rubber plates on a rotary press, is a new application of the relief process. It requires fast-drying fluid inks. Flexography is generally used to print flexible packaging as well as reprints and other low-cost reading material. Steel die stamping and copper plate engraving are applications of gravure printing. In both methods, the printing image is cut into the surface of the plate, and both use all three types of presses: the platen, the flatbed, and the rotary. They're generally used to print fine stationery or other work requiring fine details, such as stock certificates and money. Rotogravure, which uses copper-plated cylinders, is another method of gravure printing. Rotogravure presses are generally web-fed and are used for work requiring speed and long runs. There is only one basic method of silk screen printing, and any variation we find in this process is based on the method of preparing the stencil, which can be cut by hand or made photographically. Most silk screen printing is still largely a hand operation, but an increasing amount is being done by mechanical and automatic methods. Since each printing process has its own particular characteristics, each will also have certain advantages and disadvantages, and these must be taken into account in determining which process is best suited for a particular kind of work. When a job calls for extensive use of type, letterpress is generally used because with this process we can go directly from typesetting to press without the intermediate steps the other processes are. This, of course, is true only if the run is a short one. When letterpress is to be used for long runs, or when duplicate plates are necessary to permit runs in many publications at the same time, electrotypes may be made. These are plates cast from a mold made from the original plate. Stereotypes are another method of making duplicate letterpress plates. In this method, a heavy paper-like material is pressed on the original plate to form a mold, which is later used to cast the duplicate plate. Stereotype is widely used in newspaper printing to cast the curved plates for the rotary presses. For some jobs requiring duplicate plates, it may be more advantageous to use lithography. If a job requires large-size plates, such as those needed for posters, the chances are that lithography rather than letterpress would be used, because letterpress plates become much more expensive as their size increases. Silk screen is also used for poster work because it has the advantage of being very economical for short runs. However, when it comes to recording very fine detail, it's not as effective as the other processes because of the size limitations of the screen openings. But silk screen is widely used for printing on glass and china because it is the only process that requires no pressure to print. This is a good example of how the material to be printed upon will often determine the process which should be used. Printing on metal, such as tin plate for cans, is normally done by the lithographic offset method, because the metal, being hard and unyielding, will more easily accept ink from a soft surface, such as the blanket-covered intermediate cylinder of a lithographic offset press. Intaglio or relief are generally used on transparent, flexible materials for packaging, such as cellophane, or for labeling or packaging materials such as metal foils. Any of the gravure methods will give the thick ink film that these materials require to produce fine quality printing. But flexography is the only relief method for flexible packaging. And of course, the big advantage of flexography is its use of flexible rubber plates, which are cheaper and easier to make. On materials such as this cloth for book bindings, all processes can be used. A relief method known as hot gold leaf stamping produces excellent reproductions on both real and simulated cloth. But when a cloth binding requires intricate design or color, this is generally done by lithographic offset. In terms of results, intaglio is excellent for printing on paper or cloth, particularly if it is a large volume job and there are many illustrations. This kind of work is generally done by the rotogravure method. The higher cost of making the printing images is absorbed by the large volume they can produce, as well as the lower cost papers they can use. Inasmuch as factors such as these are usually taken into account in selecting a process, they also serve as reliable guides in determining which process was used for a particular job. But when it comes to judging the work itself, it often requires the skill and experience of an expert to make a positive identification of the process or method used. For all our printing processes and methods can produce high-quality work if they are used properly. And today, with all our skills and equipment, proper use is largely a matter of being able to select the right process for the job. And as you have seen, practically all materials are capable of carrying reproductions, and there are printing methods to meet almost any problem. It is this great variety in both methods and materials that make an understanding of the basic printing processes essential, not only for those working in printing, but for anyone dealing with the printing industry.